State repression, which was always a fact of life for the FAU, became more intense in the early 1970s. By then, many of the FAU's members were behind bars. Torture in the prisons became commonplace. To get a taste of what some endured, here's a story from an interview with Juan Carlos Mechoso, one of the co-founders of the FAU and later the CNT. He describes an experience of his brother, Alberto. One very rainy night in 1972, he managed to escape following horrific torture. His mouth toothless, his body torn, and his feet aching from long torture sessions, he escaped through a bathroom window. He slipped through easily thanks to the serious weight loss from weeks of torture, electric shock treatment, and interrogation. He made it onto the roof of the army barracks, waited there for the changing of the guard, and then, with whatever strength he could muster, he leapt onto a tree, clung to a branch, and fell to the earth with a thud. Getting to his feet, he made a run for it. The troops spotted him and opened fire, firing dozens of shots. Alberto just kept on running. He came to a ditch where there was an open sewer. He ran on, the stinking water up to his knees. He came to a humble dwelling, knocked on the door, and asked for help. The family living in poverty there were afraid but showed solidarity with the fugitive. In 1973, a military coup was successful, and a military dictatorship now reigned. At this point, many leftist groups in Uruguay, including the FAU, fled to Argentina. The FAU considered this a strategic retreat, as Argentina was the only Southern Cone country not under dictatorship at the time, allowing greater freedom of action still. From Argentina, the FAU backed and largely carried out the 15-day general strike in 1973, after the Uruguayan Communist Party shamefully withdrew its support for the strike and sought to open a dialogue with the country's military rulers instead. This general strike ended with most of the trade union leaders in jail, dead, or exiled. Operation Condor began in 1975. This was a campaign of political repression by the right-wing dictatorships in the Southern Cone, formally lasting until 1983. They were backed by the United States, which both collaborated and financed the covert operations. Between 60,000 and 80,000 suspected leftist sympathizers were killed. By the end of 1976, all FAU members in Uruguay were either exiled, killed, or in prison. The Uruguayan military dictatorship became known as Latin America's torture chamber. 1 in 30 Uruguayan adults spent time in prison from 1968 to 1978, and 1 in 62 were tortured. In 1976, Argentina was the last of the Southern Cone countries to fall to dictatorship. Leftists and sympathizers were hunted down, and many of the FAU were rounded up, with 35 being disappeared after unspeakable torture. All the other leftist orgs, which had also retreated to Argentina, suffered repression. However, the FAU suffered more deaths per capita than any other Uruguayan organization while in Argentina. Though they were a small and under-resourced organization, their continued commitment to political coalition building abroad made them an important target of both Uruguayan and Argentine governments. As with every other large-scale U.S. military intelligence operation, there are real economic interests which drove Operation Condor. Neocolonial investments from the global north, mostly the U.S., owned and still own most of Latin America's economy. Just looking at Uruguay, U.S.-based capital owned 80 of the largest Uruguayan companies in 1969. Uruguayan workers were not just fighting their own capitalist class, but the imperial capitalists of the U.S. empire, and They were very aware of this. Writings about the imperial dynamics that they were struggling against are found throughout the FAU's writings, sometimes even in the communiques of OPR 33 actions. One time, in 1969, during a bank workers' strike, OPR 33 militants broke the bank and poured acid on the bank's mainframe computer, destroying it, and in the communique, they declared both solidarity with the striking bank workers, as well as denouncing the bank's role in facilitating financial imperialism in Uruguay. The success of the political organization meant it became an actual, serious danger to the capitalist class and the state. Pictured here are some of the martyrs of the FAU, all killed by the state, most of them, likely all of them, tortured extensively before their deaths. To tell just the briefest of stories of a few of those pictured, Victoria Grissonis was a member of ROE and the FAU. She was studying in Montevideo when she joined the FAU. In September 1976, her partner was executed in front of her and her children, and they were all kidnapped by the Argentinian dictatorship. She was seen for the last time in Orletti, a prison where many leftists went and were never seen again. Her children, Anatole and Victoria, were taken by the dictatorship and abandoned in a plaza in Chile. They became what were the first grandchildren recovered by the group Grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo, an organization formed to care for and return children of the disappeared to their families. Victoria Grissonis is assumed to be in one of the mass graves of the disappeared. Ivan Morales Generali was born into a humble home, and by the time he was a young man, he already demonstrated serious passion and commitment. As a worker, he joined ROE, and soon after, he became a member of the FAU. He was mainly involved in financing activities as a member of OPR 33. During the strategic retreat, he also settled in Argentina with other comrades. However, he returned home to Uruguay to see his newborn son in November 1974, and he was arrested, tortured, and killed by the 6th Cavalry Regiment. The torturers themselves handed the body over to his family. Ari Cabrera was a dedicated union activist and prominent member of the FAU. He began working as a carpenter at a very young age and later became an employee at the Banco do Brasil, through which he began his union activity in the Bank Employees Union. At the beginning of the 1970s, due to his organizing with the union, he was detained in Punta Carretas Penitentiary. In 1971, he was one of those 111 prisoners who escaped. After the coup in Uruguay in 1973, he migrated to Argentina, where he was also disappeared from Orletti after the coup in Argentina. As a young woman, Cecilia Piti Trias, as she was known, joined ROE while studying to be a teacher and was active in the student sector. She became interested in anarchism and eventually joined the FAU. Together with Washington Cram, a FAU construction worker, they migrated to Argentina during the strategic retreat. In Buenos Aires, they would have their son, Marcos Cram Trias, before both were arrested in 1976 by task forces of the dictatorship. Cecilia and Washington ended up at Orletti and were never seen again. Marcos, their son, was taken in by their grandmother. The year after the fall of the dictatorship, the FAU reformed in Uruguay and are still there today. Members are in contact with many anarchists and other anarchist communist organizations around the world. They're known for being very generous with their time and accumulated knowledge. We've spent a bit of time talking about repression for a few reasons: to demonstrate FAU members' commitment, bravery, and sacrifice, and to remind us that the stakes for a revolutionary are extremely high. We also want to say that the lesson here is not that if you join an organization, you will be tortured. Operation Condor cast an extremely wide net. Basically, anyone remotely suspected of being sympathetic to leftism was rounded up. Many everyday people were killed. Students, teachers, journalists, nuns, monks, trade unionists. Now, remember the general strike that failed to bring down the dictatorship in 1973? While it failed at the time, it was influential on a later series of general strikes in 1984, which did bring down the dictatorship. The group calling for the later successful general strike of 1984 was the PIT, which was essentially the CNT, but under a new name, as the CNT had been outlawed. Once the dictatorship was ended, members ended up renaming themselves the PIT-CNT as the CNT was no longer outlawed. There's much to be learned from the history of the FAU. A few lessons we'll mention before we end are: first, revolutionaries are a small minority of the population. The classic problem here is how, then, does a revolutionary achieve a revolution? The FAU provides a very interesting example of how a small group of people has had an enormous influence in developing real revolutionary potential in mass movements. They did not do this by taking positions of power over people, but by building a popular power, increasing the people's collective ability to self-manage their own lives. They did this through both the day-to-day work, building trust and earning respect from their fellow workers and neighbors, and through the organizations they built. They had their own anarchist organization, but also built very effective mass organizations. Second, Uruguay got pretty close to an actual revolution, and this really terrified the ruling class. The FAU says that 90% of the work they do is in social movements, while 10% is spent on their internal organizational work. They are actively involved in organizing and fighting in the class struggle. They did not form an org, which ended up just spending most of its time and energy reproducing the org itself. Instead, they built a serious fighting organization. Third, members of the FAU took anarchist theory, especially the theory of Malatesta and Bakunin, very seriously, and they built their organization based on solid anarchist principles. Especifismo came out of this organization, its body of theory based on decades of struggle by an anarchist organization built on classic anarchist principles. It is not a philosophical theory or an intellectual exercise. It's hard-won lessons learned from fighting. If you'd like to learn more, see the notes for the source material for this presentation. In particular, Troy Andreas Araiza Kokinis' Anarchist Popular Power. Feel free to also visit especifismostudies.org, where you can sign up for the Militant Kindergarten Seminar to study Especifismo theory together in a shared learning space. Long live the social revolution.